welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Turn the Page. I'm your host today, Jen, and today I am joined by the author of an absolute joyride of a novella and other things, but it's a novella that we are here to discuss today. I'm so excited to dive into this book and all of the work that went into it. So welcome. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Sure. Hi, I'm Nicholas Binge. I'm an author of various different sort of genre blending types of speculative thrillers, things like Ascension, Dissolution. But here today we're going to talk about my new novella, which is out with Tor in October, called Extremity. Which, yeah, I'm excited to be here to chat about.
Thanks so much for sharing it with me and our listeners and your time. Before we hop into the book itself, could you tell us a little bit about your writing career and perhaps some of those other titles that you mentioned?
Sure. Yeah. So I've been writing and publishing for a fair few years now, and I think though I'd kind of published some stuff on a smaller scale previously, my sort of quote unquote breakout novel in the sense that it got a lot of attention was Ascension, that published back in 2023, and that was very much again sort of speculative thriller, sci-fi concepts, but set up in a kind of a very thrillery or almost horror-y type of packaging. And that was all about a big mountain appearing in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And we published that internationally in 2023, and since then it's been published in about a dozen different languages. There's a film in development. There's all sorts of exciting things happening. Um, my next book after that was Dissolution, which came out actually earlier this year, back in March. This year was the next kind of full novel. And again, that sort of sci-fi, time travel-y, sort of thriller, about a woman whose husband has dementia, and she kind of has to dive into his memories to work out what's going on and what's causing it. And that was a lot of fun to write. It was a real challenge to write in many ways. This was interesting. So now obviously Extremity has come out. It's a novella. It's much shorter, and in many ways it's a different beast to tackle than a novel that's kind of 90, 100,000 words. You've got a lot less space to play with your ideas.
Yeah, I'm really curious about what goes into that decision to keep something not constrained, but limited to the size of a novella versus a full-length novel. What was the inception point for this story, and what guided you toward the choice to make it a novella?
So part of it was part of it was practical, and part of it was a sort of creative challenge to myself. Part of the practicality of it was a kind of I'm quite prolific, and I was producing quite a lot of work, and I was aware that it's difficult to you could maybe publish a novel a year, but you don't really want to publish two full novels in a year. You're kind of crowding your own market a little bit to some degree. But I part of it was looking at the success that, particularly in the sci-fi and fantasy space, that places like Tor were having with novellas, and thinking that a novella could hit a different market, or maybe it could hit a market that were enjoying my novels and then had time for a shorter little piece. And I enjoyed that as a creative challenge. I wanted to try and pack as much as I could into sort of a tight 35, 40,000 words. And for me, the novellas that really work very, very well, and that kind of lean into the novella format, are the ones that you actually can finish in one sitting. I think they lend themselves to that. Some of my favorite novellas are the ones that I have finished in one sitting. It's very hard to finish an 100,000 plus word novel in one sitting, just purely because of time constraints, right? Whereas if something's captivating enough as a novella, and you do have 3 or 4 hours in your day, you can power through the entire thing at once. And I think that experience of just swallowing an entire story down in one gulp, is a kind of a chat. I wanted to write something that maybe not every reader, but at least some readers would have that experience. And so that's really what I set out to do. I set out to just kind of do something that A, was pacey, that was frenetic, that really turned the page, but also just continually escalated and amped the stakes right up until that kind of very, very last page. So you didn't feel like you could put it down. And that was a fun creative challenge for myself, I think, as an author.
Nice. That's really interesting. I think, it might be an imperfect metaphor, but if reading a novel is like watching a mini series or a TV show over several sittings, a novella can be like watching a film, where you're going to finish it in one sitting and have a complete, coherent experience all at once. And it absolutely works that way. I read it in one sitting, and it is a very pacey story, and
Great.
it does a lot of world building for your world really, really quickly. So something that I have a question about actually is how does the genre that you chose, the sort of like procedural with sci-fi mixed in and
Yeah.
things going on, how does that relate to the structure? Um, it has a kind of documentary feel because you use witness statements and personal testimonies. Can you talk about those choices?
Yeah, sure. I think I'm as if anyone listening to this podcast has read any of my other books, they'll know that I am one that can't seem to sit and write something in a kind of traditional narrative style. I don't know why. Whether that's, I can say that I'm trying to kind of push myself creatively, but I think it's just that I get a little bit bored and want to do something a little bit different. So, Ascension was written mainly through letters. It was an epistolary format. A lot of Dissolution was written through kind of transcripts and kind of recollections and things like that. And this one, as you say, it's written as though the three main characters, the three POV characters, uh are being interviewed sort of in like a police deposition at the end of a whatever has happened, and they're giving their accounts of events. And I pitched that partly because I knew that genre wise as I went, like I knew it was going to get weird and I knew it was going to get kind of sci-fi and horror-y at various points because that's what I'm drawn to as a writer. But another thing that I wanted to do with this novella was start in a really grounded, accessible place. Like very much in my head, I was thinking, I want someone to be able to read 99% of the first chapter and not realize they're reading an SFF book. Feel like they're in a world that makes sense, and then slowly pull that rug out from underneath them, just as it's pulled out from underneath the characters. Um, and so I wanted to lean a little bit more into the tropes of the kind of noir detective fiction, the your true detective type thing, and that part of the inspiration. I don't know if you've seen the first season of True Detective, but the moment that it kind of goes back and forth between the actual narrative and the interviews with Ross Cole, who's sitting there and kind of giving his recollection of events, those for me were the most captivating bits of the entire season. Just him sitting there talking at you. And I was just thinking, I would love to recreate that. And I would love to recreate that, but with several different perspectives so that we got maybe slightly different perceptions of events. Maybe we got slightly different pictures of what was going on. And once I started doing that, once I kind of started putting on the page, I realized that there was nothing that meant that I had to kind of do a whole chapter in one character's POV. I could switch those out as quickly as I wanted to, sometimes as little as a sentence, at various points in the book. In the same way, I suppose almost cinematically, that you could cut scene to another character talking in front of a microphone and they do the same kind of thing. And that felt like it gave me a lot of power over the story. It felt almost like, I mean, you always have power over the story as an author, but it felt a little bit like, again, to give a kind of cinematic reference, like you're a director and you can point the camera wherever you want to point it, whenever you want to, just by suddenly shifting that POV very, very quickly. And that was a lot of fun to play with in the story.
Mm. It's really efficient. Like it lets you do a lot of things at once, I think, because
Yeah,
you can move the plot along quickly while also creating tension, between the different viewpoints and when you change what you show, what you don't at a particular moment. But you also like learn a lot about the characters that way, because you learn about them as the plot is progressing by how they interact with each other and the choices they make. But when they are like, essentially in context, like alone in a room trying to explain themselves, that reveals like a lot of defensiveness and vulnerabilities that lets you learn about like different sides of them too. So it's a cool choice.
Yeah, yeah, it does give a lot of space for interiority, and lets you play with little bits of foreshadowing as well in terms of kind of them trying to defend or justify or explain why they're saying something, and they're referencing something that has happened that we as a reader don't know what it is yet. So it's just so you allow yourself to build up to it as well, and it does without giving away a massive spoiler. It allowed me to also play a little bit with kind of sort of who's telling the truth and why they're telling it at various points as well.
Yeah, absolutely. The characters are all really great. I love Julia. She is a grumpy sort of like your grizzled, slightly, no, not slightly, like pretty traumatized. There's a
Yeah,
lot going on with her, but she's so fascinating to spend time with and to see her perspective. Are there like, um, are there like characters that you have loved that sort of went into like, coding her DNA or whatever you want to call it? How did you shape her character, and how is that also like shaped by the genres that you're playing with?
I really I really enjoy writing for some reason sort of particularly badass older women in roles where they can be often, whether because of their age, whether because of their gender or things like that, perhaps uh, underestimated or thought of in a particular way. And just having her be my favorite thing about writing Julia, and kind of I would say the defining characteristic of her character, uh, as well as all of the kind of backstory and trauma and everything like that, is just that she is supremely competent at almost everything that she does in this area, but that doesn't necessarily therefore make her a good person. You know what I mean? Like, she's made some pretty terrible choices in her past, and she continues to, and she's faced with some pretty terrible choices in the novella. And I think I was wanted to explore those boundaries as well, because when someone's very, very competent, you look up to them. She gets a little bit of hero worship in this story from at least one of the other characters, right? And there was a fun exploration of kind of is that deserved, and where should that hero worship really come from? Um, and then a lot of the rest of it was just kind of discovering who they were by playing them off each other. I think, there's so you've got Julia, the kind of the very competent, slightly or more than slightly extremely cynical, sort of quite manipulative character. You've got um and then obviously the foil to that is the young, enthusiastic, naive cop who gets brought along the way, who is also incompetent in every way that Julia is competent, right? And he was by far the most fun to write. Like, one thing that was important to me to do, like, I wanted this to be pacey and frenetic. I wanted it to be exciting, and I wanted it to have emotional depth to it. But I also wanted it to be fun, and kind of crucial for me to a book that's really fun is it has to at least at some points be funny. And I think Mark was by far the most fun character to write in any particular situation, because he gets nothing right at any point. He's consistently screws up every single time that he's in a situation, and that's just really nice. And then I think so. There's three POVs in this. That that foil was to the sort of experienced, competent, young, inexperienced, incompetent, naive foil was almost too obvious. It was almost they were too diametrically opposed. And as I started writing it, I was like, I need a third. I need so that last one kind of came in last, just as like a balance on the scales a little bit, as a sort of someone in between that was both perhaps a little bit more moral than Julia, a little bit more competent than Mark, but had his own issues as well. And I think that once I had the relationship between the three and gave them a bit of backstory between each other, the novella just kind of it wrote itself almost from that point. Certainly the three characters and in their relationships with each other.
Hmm. Mark is great. He has a real like golden retriever or Labrador retriever energy where,
Yeah,
oh, I can help. Oops, sorry, like just
yeah,
immediate kind of. And yeah, and John's really great too. I love I always identify with sort of like the weary middle manager type too, for various reasons. He's a lot of
yeah.
fun. Um, so I'm gonna, try to keep this question really broad so that you can reveal whatever you are comfortable revealing. I'd love to know about how you approach world building, because I think world building is really important in this novella because you have to do a lot like in a tiny space, and that world building and having your audience know that world building is pretty essential for understanding the stakes, I would say. So like, what is
Yeah,
your approach to doing that in such a limited space and making sure that those stakes are super clear?
I think there's two things for me that I was thinking about as I was writing it. Because yes, the book gets very, very weird and over the top and fantastical by the end in a variety of different ways that I'm not going to go into now because I don't want to spoil the ride for anyone that reads it. But yeah, in order for a reader to buy that, in order for a reader to believe that the world building makes sense and it's just not coming out of left field and we're not just jumping the shark, um, the characters have to believe it as well, authentically, right? And that involves to some degree them questioning it and working it out for themselves. Um, but it also involves them it fitting within their worldview. And this is something the book is also to some degree a societal commentary on the relationships that we have with the power structures around us. And I suppose it was less like would this technology or would this sci-fi concept exist that I was asking, and it was more the question of if this technology and sci-fi concept existed, would it make sense that this is how the people who are in power and the people who had charge of it would use it? And to me, the answer was yes, absolutely. Of course it would, right? And I think if you could get your reader to believe that, and you can get your characters to believe that, then you can get them to kind of go with you almost anywhere to some degree. It's more like do the character choices make sense rather than does do we have to, suspend disbelief in order to accept that this sci-fi concept exists? Because if you believe that the character choices make sense, in my experience, I think a reader will follow you almost anywhere, speculatively. And so really that was the central uh point for me. And yeah, it's about doing it gradually, I guess, I suppose, as well. Like the idea was always that every single chapter just not only ramps up the tension, but also ramps up the sort of the extent of the kind of speculative things going on. It just gives you a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more until there's this wonderful moment where, and it's not a massive spoiler necessarily, but where one of the characters is high off his mind on coke in one of the later chapters, and basically turns around and recounts everything that's just happened in the past kind of three chapters, or the situation that they're in. And as I was writing it, I was like, wow, this novella has really gone places, but it's a nice kind of like recap of where we've got to at that moment.
It's a great scene. And you're absolutely correct. I think it's a really good point that like the commentary also contributes towards building those stakes. Again, like keeping it vague. I think most people in the world at this point can understand what it's like to live in a world where like that is shaped by rich people ignoring the consequences of their choices, And so
Yeah,
like that also being threaded through like makes it very clear about like, oh, if the characters don't do this, this really awful stuff is going to happen. It's so much fun. It's well executed and you do a lot of complex stuff in such a small space. It's very impressive.
thank you. No, I'm glad it worked for you, and I'm glad. Yeah, it's tricky sometimes trying to do all of that. The funny thing is, it's tricky sometimes trying to do all of that sort of societal commentary, I suppose, and it being a metaphor for a lot of those more complex modern day societal issues, and also have a sort of a pacey, compelling mystery that you want to turn the page and keep reading at the same time. But I think, in a somewhat depressing way, the current world that we live in does a lot of that world building for me. Because it's not actually that far removed, even though it feels that way. And so yeah, the work is kind of already baked in a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Is this a world you feel like you could spend more time in? Do you have more stories to tell in this world?
Yeah, I have more stories to tell in this world. I could come back to these characters for sure. I don't know if I will immediately. I've got another novella out with Tor in May, which is a completely different standalone. It's not a sequel to this one. It's another thing. Um, but I think yeah, I think Julia has more places to go as a character. Definitely, and I think that again, while the story of this novella I think, or at least it was the aim, uh, wraps up with a kind of a sort of satisfying conclusion. There is definitely a sort of a final rug pull at the very, very end, which opens things up for possible future implications that it would be fun to return to for sure.
Muted, sorry. I am very glad to hear that because I could absolutely also spend more time with these characters, and I am interested about that little rug pull, but I'm also very excited for this next novella. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So that one's called Abyss, and it is out in May. And it's again very different. It's I say very different in terms of content, but then I think similar in terms of like a lot of people that have read a few of my books recognize a kind of a through line of style, if nothing else. And a lot of that is this some certainly with these novellas a similar sort of societal commentary, though about different things. A similar sort of pacing and sort of thriller-esque attitude, though this one leans, I would say, more horror than sort of police crime scenario. Yeah, it's a Abyss is really my take on a sort of a corporate horror and an exploration of the weirdness and the absurdities of um the kind of modern corporate workspace, I suppose, to some degree. Not dissimilar to Severance, but with a bit more kind of a bit more horror and a bit more perhaps kind of cosmic Lovecraftian inspirations going on at the same time.
Ooh, well, that sounds great. I look forward to that as well. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me and our listeners. I'm very excited to recommend this to people at the library.
Thank you so much for having me. No, I really appreciate it, and I'm really glad you enjoyed the book.
Thank you. All right, listeners, please check out Extremity. By the time that you hear this, it'll be out in the world. So head to your favorite bookstore or library, website, wherever you like to get your books. All right, it's time to close this chapter. We'll see you next time.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.